"Stop, you bastard!" the police officer shouted, yanking Marcus's shoulder roughly, but he didn't move. "Who do you think you're standing in the middle of this street without a reason?" Marcus turned around, his gaze colder than ice, his mouth curling into a mocking smile. "Do you really believe you have the right to treat me like this?" Marcus pulled out his FBI badge, his voice as sharp as a knife. "You just arrested an FBI agent. Now you're going to pay for this foolishness." The officer couldn't believe his ears, his face turning pale, but he couldn't back down. The scene that afternoon was unusually quiet, with the fresh air of the white neighborhood, clean streets, and the warm glow of the afternoon sun. The neighborhood seemed like a perfect picture with no signs of disruption or instability. Yet, in the midst of this scene, Marcus Reed, a black man dressed in an expensive business suit, stood silently in front of a closed bookstore. His hair was short and neat, and his deep black eyes never left the storefront of the closed shop. Everything around him seemed ordinary, but something about his presence made the atmosphere feel heavier. Cars passed by on the road, pedestrians walked back and forth, yet no one paid attention to him. Marcus stood there, and though he was physically present, his presence made the air feel unsettled. A black man in business attire standing alone in this neighborhood seemed out of place. No one spoke, no one looked directly at him, but Marcus could sense the discomfort in the fleeting glances. His image standing there seemed to fracture the otherwise beautiful picture of the neighborhood. Then a police car suddenly pulled over, shattering the stillness. The car door opened, and Officer Ryan Miller stepped out. He was fresh out of the academy, inexperienced, but always felt the need to assert his authority. When Ryan's eyes fell on Marcus standing alone, doubt quickly flooded his mind. He didn't need a clear reason, he just felt that something was off. In his mind, a thought quickly formed. This black man didn't belong here. That was a reasonable excuse to approach. He decided to move forward without hesitation. "Stop!" Ryan shouted as he approached, his voice filled with suspicion and authority. His words echoed in the quiet space, causing people around to glance over. But no one stopped. They just kept walking as if this didn't concern them. "What's going on? Standing alone in this area, you don't look like you belong here." Ryan continued, his eyes scanning Marcus's appearance as if searching for something amiss. His words, though not clear, were certainly not accidental. They were full of discrimination, prejudice, and judgment based purely on the man's skin color. It was an unnecessary question without any valid reason, just a hasty judgment Ryan didn't even recognize. Marcus didn't rush, nor was he afraid. He stood tall, his gaze cold, but there was no tension in his demeanor. His breath steady, his deep black eyes locked onto Ryan's without blinking, as if telling him that he wasn't someone easily intimidated. A moment of silence passed before he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not obligated to show identification without a valid reason." Marcus' words were not loud, nor did they carry any challenge, but they were a subtle warning to Ryan. He was not someone to be easily bullied. Marcus's response left Ryan momentarily stunned. He hadn't expected to face a man who wouldn't be easily subdued. Marcus's words were not defiance, but they certainly made Ryan uneasy. He was not used to encountering someone who wasn't intimidated by the power of the police. Ryan tried to maintain his stance, but the feeling of anxiety began to rise within him. Marcus's calm demeanor seemed to challenge his authority without doing anything overt. Ryan felt a sense of helplessness in the very demands he had made. From inside the car, the older officer, who had been silent from the start, just observing now, began paying closer attention to the conversation. The older officer may not fully grasp the tension of the situation, but something in Marcus's attitude made him feel that something was amiss. Things had gone further than he had expected. Still, he said nothing, only observing and waiting. Ryan stood facing Marcus, his eyes filled with confusion and doubt, unsure what to do next. Marcus' words weren't a direct challenge, but they carried a powerful weight that made anyone listening stop and question themselves. "What right do you have to arrest me?" Marcus continued, his voice still calm. There was no anger, no fear, but the coldness in his words made Ryan feel more and more like he was standing on unstable ground. He sensed the tension in the air, and part of him knew he had gone too far, but he didn't know how to back off. Ryan clenched his fists, starting to feel as though he was losing control. In his eyes, Marcus wasn't just a black man standing silently in this neighborhood. He was someone with authority, with a calmness that Ryan couldn't comprehend. And right then, everything began to shift. The doubt that had been there from the start began to rise, and the racism Ryan hadn't even realized he harbored was now becoming clear to him. His hasty thoughts were now reduced to a vague feeling. Marcus wasn't just standing there. He was a symbol of resistance that Ryan couldn't push away. With each passing second, the sidelong glances from those around them made the atmosphere even heavier. The people standing nearby began to look back, but no one dared to speak out, only offering curious yet wary glances. From those furtive looks, Marcus understood that in this neighborhood his presence was unwelcome. But that only made him more resolute, stronger with every word and action. He stood there, separate from the suspicion and discrimination Ryan was trying to impose on him. But it was Marcus's silence and stillness that Ryan could not counter. And from that point, the confrontation was no longer just about an arrest. It began to transform into a battle of power, of discrimination, and the struggle between values that Marcus had always stood firm for. For Ryan, it was a challenge he had never imagined in his career. Ryan stood tall, squinting as he looked at Marcus, a sense of power starting to rise within him. Since starting his job, he had always felt the need to assert his authority as a police officer. Though he had no clear reason, he decided to approach Marcus, as something about this man's presence made it impossible for Ryan to ignore him. "Stop," Ryan ordered, his voice full of authority. He stepped closer, feeling his sense of power surge. "Show your ID immediately." This wasn't a simple request, but a command. Ryan felt he had the right to demand that people stop and prove themselves, even though deep down he knew the reason for stopping Marcus was unclear. However, in that moment, Ryan didn't think too much about it. He felt in control of the situation. Marcus didn't back down. Instead, he looked Ryan directly in the eyes, showing neither fear nor unease. His calm demeanor, the resolve and stillness in every movement, only made the situation more tense. Sensing the weight of that silence, Ryan became even more determined to check Marcus. But Marcus simply responded calmly, though with unwavering resolve. "If you have no reason, I don't have to show anything." A soft-spoken sentence, but one that served as a reminder that he had the right to refuse a police officer's request if there was no legitimate reason. Marcus's cold stare made Ryan hesitate for a moment. It wasn't an aggressive reaction or a challenge, it was an assertion of his own power. Marcus was fully aware of his rights, and he was using his calm to communicate that message. The words he spoke weren't grand, but they were certainly strong enough to make Ryan question himself. Ryan, feeling a conflict within, began to realize he had to assert his authority once again. Although doubt was rising within him, Ryan didn't want a black man, someone he felt didn't belong in this neighborhood, to refuse his request without any intervention. He turned back to his car, his movements slightly hurried and uneasy. Part of him understood that Marcus had the right to refuse, but the confidence in his role as a police officer was stronger. "I need backup," Ryan ordered into the radio, his voice betraying his discomfort. He didn't know why he felt this way, but Marcus was still standing there unmoving, not backing down and showing no signs of cooperation. The tension in the air grew thicker. The people walking by began to pay more attention to the situation, and Marcus couldn't help but notice that he was the only one maintaining calm in the midst of the escalating tension. When another police car arrived, Ryan felt a small sense of comfort and having additional support. He didn't know why, but there was something in Marcus's demeanor that made Ryan feel uncertain. It seemed that every move Marcus made had a purpose, and he knew exactly what he was doing. That feeling only deepened Ryan's confusion. The sense of power within him began to fade. Immediately, the officer in charge of the new car got out and began to approach Marcus. But before he could say anything, Marcus calmly stated, "No need for more officers. officers. "If you don't have a valid reason, I'm not cooperating." Marcus's voice wasn't loud, but it was filled with determination, making the atmosphere even more tense. The officer in charge, David Stone, didn't know what to do. He could feel the confidence in Marcus's actions, and inside he began to doubt whether this was truly necessary. However, Ryan couldn't stand the silence for too long. He turned to David and lowered his voice. "I asked to check this man. Don't you see that? Why are you just standing there, doing nothing?" David didn't respond immediately, but his gaze briefly scanned Marcus once more. Something felt off, but David didn't dare argue. Marcus remained standing tall, showing no signs that he would react strongly. His calmness made the officers feel uneasy, as if they were the ones breaking the law, not Marcus. In that moment, Ryan couldn't hide his disappointment. He had once thought that with his position he could control everything, but now he was standing before a man with a stronger sense of power than any police officer in the neighborhood. Marcus's gaze seemed to pierce through every fear and doubt Ryan had. As the silence stretched on, a light breeze passed by, carrying an indescribable feeling. The officers still stood there silent, but each passing minute made everything more complicated. Ryan and his colleagues' sense of power began to crumble. None of them realized that a man in an expensive business suit, someone they thought could be easily oppressed, could strip them of their sense of authority. Marcus didn't need to do anything more. He had said enough through his actions, simply by standing tall, holding his ground, and not backing down. The tension in the air grew thicker, and the people around began to stop turning to watch the unfolding scene. Their looks were curious, but also full of concern, as if they sensed something bigger was about to happen. Ryan Miller, a young officer new to the job, stood there with a confused and worried expression. He couldn't stop feeling that he was losing control. The doubt and unease within him became clearer with every passing moment. When the last police car finally left, Ryan didn't know what to do next. Marcus Reed still stood there, unmoving, unresistant. Just one sentence, one look was enough for Ryan to begin realizing that he had been wrong from the start. Marcus wasn't in a hurry. He knew this situation would change, but there was no need for him to do anything dramatic. Slowly, he reached into his coat pocket without any need for grand gestures, then pulled out an FBI identification badge, holding it in his hand. The badge wasn't large, but it carried an invisible power, as if it contained authority that even the officers who seemed unchallengeable had to bow to. "You just arrested an FBI agent," Marcus said, his voice calm but sharp. There was no need for anything more, just that statement, simple and direct. Everything was different now. Ryan froze as if he couldn't process the information he had just heard. His body went rigid, his eyes staring at the badge in Marcus's hand, unable to believe what he was seeing. The whole space seemed to stop in that moment, and Ryan couldn't move his mind in turmoil, unable to accept that he had just arrested an FBI agent by mistake. Conflicting thoughts spun in his head, offering reasons to dismiss the truth, but everything seemed to blur in the face of Marcus's certainty. No way, the young officer wondered in his mind. How could this be? He looked at Marcus, then at the badge, and despite trying to remain calm, Ryan couldn't hide the confusion that was now evident on his face. "You think I'll believe this?" Ryan asked, his voice now tinged with sharpness, revealing his lack of confidence. His words came from a deep sense of doubt, not only about Marcus, but also about himself. "FBI agent. Are you kidding me?" The question rushed out a defensive reaction from Ryan. He couldn't understand how this was possible. A black man standing quietly in the middle of a peaceful neighborhood, dressed in a business suit, showing no signs of danger. How could he possibly be an FBI agent? And then, when he saw the badge, his mind couldn't accept the truth that he had made such a huge mistake. A police officer, especially a young one like him, could not afford to make such a serious error. But Marcus didn't respond to the doubt. He just stared directly into Ryan's eyes, his gaze unwavering. A moment of silence passed, then he spoke again, quietly but firmly, as if it had been carefully calculated from the start. "Yes, you just arrested an FBI agent." There was no anger, no challenge, just a simple affirmation. He didn't need to say anything more. That one sentence was enough for Ryan to understand that he was facing a huge mistake. Marcus's words didn't need to be loud, didn't need to be forceful, but they were sharp and clear, exposing a truth that Ryan couldn't deny. And this didn't just surprise Ryan, it caused all the confidence he had built up over the years to vanish. Ryan stood there motionless, his eyes blank. Marcus's response hit him like a direct shock. He didn't know what to do next. Everything Ryan had known, every theory he had learned about police power was now shattered right before his eyes. An FBI agent, a black man standing here, instantly making the power of the police meaningless. In that brief moment, Ryan felt like he was no longer in control of the situation. Everything was upside down. Not only had he made a mistake by arresting an innocent person, but he also failed to recognize the latent danger in judging someone based on their skin color. From inside the police car, the older officer, David Stone, silently observed the scene. He said nothing, but his eyes held a deep concern and thoughts that couldn't be easily expressed. How many times had he witnessed such mistakes? But this time it felt more serious. His young officer, Ryan, had not only made a mistake in handling the situation, but he had also put himself in a difficult position. David sighed, slowly, turning away as if he couldn't bear to witness this failure any longer. Both officers stood in the shadow of mistakes they couldn't avoid, especially Ryan, who now stood amidst confusion, unsure of what to do with himself. Marcus didn't rush to explain more, nor was there any hint of anger. He just continued standing there, his presence increasingly making the atmosphere heavier. Marcus knew he didn't need to speak too much. His silence was the strongest affirmation. He didn't need to elaborate on the power he held. It was all too clear already, and just with a little more time, the price the police would pay would become evident. He didn't need to do anything more. Simply, by standing still, he had made Ryan and his colleague feel their own helplessness. From that moment on, Ryan no longer knew what to do. He turned to look at Marcus again, his eyes filled with anxiety and doubt. But in those eyes there was something else, an undeniable feeling that Marcus had the upper hand. The racism Ryan had unknowingly carried now weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't escape the reality that he had made a huge mistake, and Marcus was not resisting, not showing fear. He didn't need to do anything, just stand there with his FBI badge in hand, and his silence forced Ryan to confront a truth he couldn't avoid. Finally, as the tension gradually eased, Marcus said nothing more. He just stood there, between the two officers in a quiet space. No fear, no panic, just a resilience that Ryan couldn't ignore. His thoughts began to swirl, but Marcus's words continued to echo in his mind. "You just arrested an FBI agent." And all that was left was the helplessness of the police and the belated realization of an irreparable mistake. Ryan felt a sensation he couldn't describe in his gut, a heaviness he had never experienced. Standing in front of Marcus, he realized his mistake, but he didn't want to admit it immediately. Fear and worry began to creep into his mind, but he tried to push them aside. Trying to maintain his composure, he smiled gently, as if everything were fine. But that smile couldn't hide the tension rising within him. His eyes briefly glanced at the people around the curious gazes from the community, and a sense of unease grew in him. They didn't say anything, but Ryan could feel their attention. They all knew what was happening. He knew he had made a serious mistake, but still didn't want to face it. Trying to hold it together, Ryan turned away, but couldn't escape the truth. Even in that brief moment, Ryan felt his confidence slipping away, replaced by confusion. He wondered how he could have overlooked something so big. How could a man, potentially an FBI agent, stand right in front of him without him realizing? From inside the car, Chief of Police Donald McCrae received the report about the incident. He was a seasoned officer, always maintaining discipline and responsibility in his work, but this time the situation had gone far beyond what he had imagined. When he heard about the wrongful arrest, he couldn't ignore it. This wasn't just about police work, it was about the community's trust in the law enforcement agency. Immediately, McCrae ordered an investigation into the incident and instructed his staff to report the details. While he understood that the situation might be serious, he still couldn't believe a wrongful arrest had occurred in this neighborhood, a neighborhood the police had always prided themselves on for its peace and safety. When the report from Ryan reached him, McCrae couldn't help but feel uneasy. Arresting a black man without any suspicion that he could be an FBI agent was an unforgivable oversight, especially when such an incident happened right under his jurisdiction. McCrae began to realize this matter couldn't be dealt with lightly. This wasn't just a minor mistake to brush off. He needed to investigate thoroughly, uncover the cause, and hold those responsible accountable. But inside, his worry began to grow. He had never faced a situation like this before, and he wasn't sure how this would affect the police department's image. Especially with an FBI agent being wrongfully arrested, things were no longer as simple as they seemed. Meanwhile, Ryan couldn't stop worrying. He didn't know how to face the truth, a feeling of unease spreading throughout his body. "This can't be true," Ryan muttered to himself, his voice trembling slightly. Everything had happened so fast, and now he found himself in the middle of a hole he had dug himself. Everything Ryan had ever learned about controlling situations, about the power of the police, was now shattered. Inside him, everything kept repeating like an unhealed wound. He didn't know what to do next. The older officer, David Stone, still stood there saying nothing, but his gaze spoke volumes. It was a reprimand, an understanding that everything had spiraled out of control. Ryan felt like a child lost in his own job, facing the truth that he couldn't deny. McCrae received the report from his officers, and the tension only grew. He instructed Ryan and the officers at the scene to come to his office immediately to clarify the situation. The confusion and panic were impossible to shake off in Ryan's mind. He knew this meeting would not be easy. No matter how much he tried to explain, the truth remained. Arresting an FBI agent by mistake could not be overlooked. This wasn't just a career mistake. It was a serious one affecting the public's trust in the police force. Ryan began to realize that he could lose everything because of this one error. But what made him feel worse was Marcus's silence. The man he had just arrested not showing any anger or urgency, but simply standing still and looking at Ryan with unwavering determination. That look seemed to say that everything would be dealt with in a way Ryan could never have imagined. In that moment, Ryan felt Marcus's resilience, and it only made him feel as though his power was slipping away. Chief McCrae sat in his office, his mind spinning with thoughts. This incident could shake the public's trust in the police force. He couldn't let this become a bad precedent. Though he knew Ryan was a young officer with no ill intentions, this mistake had gone too far. A wrong judgment based solely on skin color and outward appearance could no longer have a place in the police force. McCrae had decided that mistakes like this wouldn't be forgiven easily. No matter how much Ryan tried to explain, his actions would have consequences. The police, no matter how much power they held, had to be accountable for their actions. Marcus remained silent, his eyes never leaving Ryan's, but showing no fear or unease. He understood that the truth would come to light, and that Ryan would have to face the consequences. Each moment of silence felt like a reminder to Ryan, making him feel increasingly out of control. The whole neighborhood, the people standing around, were now witnesses to this mistake, but Marcus didn't need to do anything more. His silence was the clearest answer that Ryan would have to face. The situation Ryan had created was impossible to ignore. The officers standing nearby realized that things had gone beyond their control. Initially, they thought this was just a simple matter, but now with an FBI agent being wrongfully arrested, the consequences would not be just a minor event in a quiet neighborhood. The incident began to draw attention from the community, and everything was slowly starting to explode. The officers standing next to Ryan could feel the tension in the air. There was something strange, uncomfortable hanging over them. They could no longer deny that they had been wrong. The two officers who were supposed to uphold justice were now the ones who had made a mistake in a situation that couldn't be fixed. Marcus still stood there, unmoving, but his silence and calmness made the situation feel heavier. The officers could no longer ignore his presence. They began to realize that their actions were not just a typical professional mistake, but a deep disrespect toward a citizen and a federal agent. They began to feel a great divide between them and the so-called power they had always believed they held. Inside, Ryan, fear began to rise. What he thought would be a normal workday had suddenly turned into a serious mistake, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he would have to face severe consequences. A few people standing nearby began to notice the strange scene unfolding in the street. Curious gazes gradually focused on Marcus and the officer. Some people started pulling out their phones and recording videos. The tension in the air grew heavier, as if time had stopped. The police couldn't stop the attention of the people around them. Though no one spoke, the phones recording everything said it all. It wasn't just the witness of a few people anymore, but footage that would be shared and spread. Ryan felt the presence of the phones as a clear sign that everything was beyond his control. Part of him wondered if things could be easily resolved as he initially thought. As the video was uploaded to social media, everything began to change. The footage of police overstepping their authority by arresting an FBI agent simply because of his skin color quickly spread like wildfire. The video started gaining massive attention from the online community, making it impossible for the witnesses to remain silent. Criticism swiftly appeared under the video, strong comments from those who could no longer tolerate the racism. From those who were outraged to those seeking justice, everyone began expressing their anger. The online community not only reacted immediately, but created a strong wave calling for an investigation and reform within the police force. What began as a simple situation had now become a symbol of injustice and abuse of power that no one could ignore. The people in the community began sharing the video at an overwhelming rate. Social media groups, human rights organizations, and influential individuals began calling for action. The community could not stay silent in the face of such a clear-cut incident. With each passing minute, the criticism continued to rise, and the video became a powerful weapon in the fight against racism and police abuse of power. Human rights organizations issued public statements demanding that the government act immediately. "This incident cannot be allowed to fade into oblivion," was the message from many calls for reform. The outrage from the community spread like an uncontrollable fire, and all authorities had to face an undeniable demand to clarify the situation and take appropriate action. This situation was not just a wrongful arrest, but a milestone in the fight against racism in law enforcement. The police, who were supposed to protect and serve justice, now had to face strong criticism from the very community they were sworn to protect. The outrage didn't just stay in the online community. It spread to political social organizations and human rights groups. It was a clear message to the police: racism would no longer be tolerated. Abuse of power and unfair actions would no longer be overlooked. Ryan began to feel the weight of the mistake he had made. Although nothing official was declared immediately, the pressure from the community created a shockwave through the police force. They could no longer stand still and pretend nothing was happening. Ryan looked at Marcus, but he didn't see the anger he had expected. Instead, Marcus stood there, his gaze calm, as if he had witnessed police abuse countless times. That feeling, Marcus's silence, made Ryan feel small and weak. He couldn't understand how someone like Marcus, oppressed right before his eyes, could remain so composed. And then the inevitable happened. The police had to face strong criticism from the public, especially Ryan, who was directly involved in the wrongful arrest. Calls and public discussions began demanding an investigation into his actions and those of the officers involved. Everything was was now focused on them, and they couldn't escape anymore. From outraged citizens to community leaders, everyone was demanding that the truth be revealed. They demanded that the officers be held accountable and that the wrongful actions be addressed. The police could no longer pretend that racism didn't exist in their system. They no longer had the power to hide the truth. Ryan looked at the video playing on the phone screen, seeing his own face alongside Marcus's image. He couldn't believe that he was the one who had contributed to this injustice. The outrage was not only from ordinary citizens, but also from those who had fought for justice, those who had endured for so many years. This video would be a powerful indictment not only against him, but also against a police system he had once trusted. Immediately after the video of Marcus's arrest was posted, a wave of outrage surged across social media. It wasn't just a small group, but a large community speaking out criticizing the actions of the police. Comments flooded in under the video, and every minute hundreds of shares followed. Social media users didn't just condemn the racist actions of the officer, they also criticized the entire police system that had long enabled such abuse of power. "This is blatant racism," one comment read. "An FBI agent arrested just because of his skin color. This is an unacceptable outrage," another comment urged. Each accusation landed like a heavy blow to the pride of the police force. The video wasn't just a personal incident. It became a powerful message, a warning to society about the injustices that had been hidden for so long. The community could no longer stay silent about what was happening. Human rights organizations, always at the forefront of fighting for the oppressed, immediately sprang into action. Meetings were held, official statements were made, calling for a comprehensive investigation into the incident, demanding that not only Officer Ryan be held accountable, but the entire police system be examined, from how officers are recruited and trained to how they wield their power. A major police reform became an urgent demand. These organizations called on the government and authorities to launch an immediate and thorough investigation, clarifying the racial discrimination within the police force and ensuring that those who abuse power would face consequences. These calls didn't stop with human rights organizations, but were also strongly supported by influential individuals in society, from community leaders to artists and celebrities. Protests began erupting in multiple cities, demanding justice for Marcus and others who had suffered racial discrimination at the hands of the police force. A series of other videos showing similar situations from the past were shared by the community. Discussions on social media weren't limited to younger generations, but spread across older generations as well, from the elderly to the youth, all sharing one unified voice: racial discrimination in the police force could no longer continue. These videos were like successive waves, and with each new video uploaded, the community's outrage grew stronger. The videos were not just evidence, they were powerful accusations aimed at the police. The situation wasn't just about the viral spread of the video. Protests began to take place with thousands of participants, not only in the affected area but across the country. Political organizations were not on the sidelines either. They began to speak out, calling for an extensive investigation into police activities with the goal of comprehensive reform. The calls not only demanded individual accountability but also pushed for policy changes and increased oversight in the execution of police power. This change was not just needed in one city or region, but had to be applied nationwide, ensuring that mistakes like Marcus' arrest would never be allowed to happen again. Chief Donald McCrae could no longer stand by and watch the situation escalate. When he received notifications about the outrage from the community and human rights organizations, he knew he couldn't let this incident fade away. The demands from the public and government had come with unavoidable pressure. McCrae, who had led a team of experienced officers, was now facing a major challenge. His career, as well as the reputation of the entire police force, was under serious threat. He had to act immediately to prevent further unrest, which is why he ordered all officers involved to report to his office to clarify the situation. Detailed reports had to be submitted, and an internal investigation was to begin without delay. McCrae felt the tension in every order he gave. His words no longer held the same weight as they once did, and he began to feel like he was standing on the brink of a major crisis. Especially when looking at the scenes on social media, he couldn't help but feel disappointment. The police force he had dedicated his life to was now being exposed by the mistakes of his own officers. Though he wanted to resolve everything quickly, McCrae knew he couldn't ignore the massive outrage from the community. A strong reform was unavoidable. Not only young Officer Ryan, but McCrae himself, as the chief, would have to face the consequences of a system that had long failed to properly address racial discrimination within law enforcement. The chief began to realize that every action he took in the coming days would determine not just his career, but the image of the police force in the eyes of the public. He had faced injustice within the system too many times, but he had never felt such intense outrage. The people, those who had endured racial discrimination, could no longer stay silent. They demanded change, and they wouldn't stop until these mistakes were corrected. The situation continued to escalate, and McCrae knew he could no longer delay. Under pressure from both the community and the government, he called for an emergency meeting to implement necessary measures, including the strict handling of officers who had violated protocol. But he also knew that it wasn't just them who had to be held accountable. The entire system needed to change. The community was watching, and there was no turning back. This incident had gone beyond the scope of a simple professional mistake. It had become a deep societal issue that couldn't be easily resolved. Ryan, meanwhile, couldn't escape the feeling of guilt. He had been wrong, and now the community's outrage was drowning him. The comments on social media, the criticisms from the public all pointed to him and the mistakes he had made. He could not avoid responsibility whether he wanted to or not. Each word, each image of Marcus replayed in his mind, and now he had to face the inevitable consequences. The official investigation was finally launched after a long day of tension. The government could no longer sit idly by as the incident had spread and attracted attention not only from human rights organizations but from society at large. An internal investigation was immediately initiated to clarify the situation and determine the responsibility of the officers involved. Reports from witnesses' video footage and testimonies from those present at the scene would serve as key evidence in reaching a conclusion. The entire police force was under intense scrutiny, and no one could ignore the injustice that had occurred. Ryan and the other officers involved in the arrest had to face a legal process they could no longer manipulate or control as they had in the past. Meanwhile, chaos within the police force was escalating. Senior officers, once influential in making important decisions, began to feel significant pressure from within. The authorities, professional investigators, immediately began gathering evidence from the videos circulating on social media and interviewing witnesses at the scene. Each answer, each detail from the witnesses added to the growing truth about the wrongful arrest. Testimonies from Marcus and the bystanders revealed clear racial discrimination in the actions of Ryan and his colleagues. A system was beginning to break down, and no one could deny this truth. The undeniable evidence gradually clarified everything, showing that the police's actions were wrong and indefensible. Both Ryan and the officers involved could not deny their mistakes. They could not argue that they had abused their power unjustly simply because of Marcus's skin color. Under the pressure of the investigation, these officers slowly began to realize the gravity of their mistake. The guilt they could no longer conceal became apparent, especially as the clear evidence was brought to light. Interviews with witnesses proved that the police's demands were unreasonable and unjustifiable. The video clips the footage from nearby civilians' cell phones revealed the situation that the young officer Ryan tried to dismiss. It was pure racism, and each testimony, every detail, forced them to confront the truth they could not deny. It wasn't just Ryan. The other officers could not avoid responsibility either. Although they could justify their actions with hasty excuses, the evidence and witness testimonies proved they had acted irrationally. The guilt within them grew, and part of them knew they could not escape the consequences. They began to realize that racism was not just a personal issue, but a widespread problem within the system they were part of. A police force could not overlook such injustice. These officers no longer had the protection of power, and now they were the lawbreakers. The community, those who witnessed the incident, and those who were not directly involved, began demanding significant change. After the video of Marcus's arrest spread widely, the community could no longer stand still. The outrage went beyond the limits of a simple wrongful arrest. People from the youth to community leaders were all calling for police reform. Racial discrimination had existed for too long within the force, and now was the time for change. Human rights organizations called on the government to take stronger action against racial discrimination and police abuse of power. They demanded a full investigation, a comprehensive review of all cases of racial discrimination in the police force, and actions to protect the rights of all citizens regardless of race or ethnicity. From large organizations to influential individuals in society, everyone was speaking out. Protests began erupting in major cities with people marching in the streets demanding justice, calling for a thorough reform within the police force. Public dialogues on the issue grew increasingly heated. Civil rights leaders, activists, and media celebrities continually urged change, insisting that racial discrimination in law enforcement must end. The discussions were no longer confined to small groups, but had expanded to national forums where politicians and powerful leaders had to face growing public pressure. This outrage was not just a protest against one wrong action, but a demand for a truly fair justice system, one that did not discriminate based on skin color or background. Ryan, faced with the results of the investigation, could not escape his responsibility. He realized that not only he, but the entire police system was paying the price for these mistakes. The public's outrage had exposed the flaws within the system, and now there was no other option but to face the truth. Chief McCrae also couldn't escape public and human rights organization criticism. His inability to control the actions of his subordinates made him reconsider how the police force was operating. Change was unavoidable, and those who had violated the system would have to be held accountable. From the officers facing investigation to the community fighting for change, everyone had to confront irreversible transformations. The community had spoken, and this change could no longer be hidden. This was the moment for the police system to face the truth, to recognize that past mistakes could not continue without consequences. What was happening was not just an investigation, but a struggle for justice, for the rights and freedoms of every individual in society. The police could no longer continue acting as they deemed fit without considering fairness and human rights. The video of Marcus's wrongful arrest didn't stop after its initial shares. It quickly spread widely, becoming a symbol of outrage in society. The footage, the tense moments between Marcus and Officer Ryan, not only drew attention but also sparked a heated debate across social media platforms. Each time the video was shared, the viewership surged. Furious comments, strong reactions from the community began to spread like an unstoppable wave. The video wasn't just about a simple mistake by a young officer, but a condemnation of a system that had allowed racism and abuse of power to persist for years without facing serious scrutiny. It became a powerful tool for opening important discussions, not just about the specific incident, but about the necessary changes within the police force overall. The videos spread, attracted the attention of international organizations, groups that had always fought for justice and human rights. These organizations could not remain silent in the face of racism and police abuse, especially when an FBI agent was treated like a criminal simply because of his skin color. Reports and calls from human rights organizations were issued continuously demanding a full investigation and a major reform within the police force. International organizations began proposing specific ways to reform the police, from changes in recruitment and training to establishing more effective oversight mechanisms for law enforcement. These calls were no longer focused on a single incident, but had become a collective struggle for society to prevent racism and abuse of power in all forms. The societal shift in awareness didn't occur in just a few days. It was a process that stretched over time. The community began to recognize racism more clearly, not only in the police force but also in other areas of society. Ordinary citizens, those who had remained silent or indifferent to these issues before, began speaking up. Public discussions about racism, police reform, and human rights became more prevalent than ever. People started to realize that change couldn't come from just one individual or a small group, but had to be a comprehensive shift in how society viewed and dealt with sensitive issues like racism and power. Protests, workshops, and campaigns calling for police reform continued drawing the involvement of influential figures in society. This was not merely a protest against one wrong action, but a call for a just society where every individual has the right to live in respect and equality. Martin, whose story initially made him a victim of racial discrimination at the hands of the police, had now become a symbol of change. However, he remained silent. Throughout this process, Martin kept his silence, avoiding interviews and not making public statements. He didn't feel the need to do anything further, as the change had already begun and it didn't require his voice. The community had risen on its own and started the fight for justice. The protests were no longer just a temporary reaction. They had become a powerful movement pushing for police reform. The community was no longer merely observers, but active participants in rebuilding society where justice and equality were upheld for everyone. Therefore, Martin's silence became a strong message that change didn't come from one individual, but from the entire community, from those who dared to stand up and say no to injustice. Not only human rights organizations and online communities were involved in the change, but the government could no longer stay out of it. The people's outrage created immense pressure, forcing the government to take concrete steps to reform the police force. Political discussions, hearings, and reform drafts began to emerge. Demands for increased oversight and accountability in law enforcement became increasingly clear. The government realized that if immediate action was not taken, public trust in the system would be severely weakened. Martin did not speak out, but he didn't need to anymore. The community had spoken for him, and the change he wanted was unfolding right before his eyes. While society slowly recognized the need for reform, Martin remained silent. He didn't need to speak, for he had seen enough. The fight for fairness wasn't just words, but the actions of an entire community that had risen up against racism and abuse of power. Marcus Reed, once a man misunderstood by society, was no longer just a victim, but a catalyst for change. Every time his video was shared, every protest that took place was evidence of the success in initiating a fight for justice, a fight that no one could stop. Martin didn't need to do anything more, as he had already succeeded in sparking a pivotal turning point in the struggle for justice and equality. The community had stood up, and nothing could stop its progress. Chief McCrae sat in his office, a heavy feeling rising within him as he received instructions from higher-ups regarding the suspension of the 2 officers involved in the wrongful arrest. McCrae was no stranger to the pressure from incidents within the police force, but this time everything felt different. The name Marcus Reed, along with the wrongful arrest and the racism involved, was becoming a major issue, not only within the police department, but across society as a whole. As McCrae McCrae reviewed the reports and heard explanations from his officers, he couldn't deny that the actions of Officer Ryan and his colleagues had crossed the line of a simple mistake. This was not just a wrongful arrest. It was a serious abuse of power. Human rights organizations and the public had spoken out forcefully, demanding change within the police force, and now McCrae could not remain silent. The suspension of Ryan Miller and the other officers was not just a routine disciplinary measure they had faced in the past. This was a serious decision reflecting the gravity of the situation. These officers were suspended for violating citizens' rights, and their actions were a clear example of racism within the force. The chief knew that this suspension could not be undone. Although Ryan was a young officer still learning his mistake had caused significant harm to the police department's image, McCrae understood that if he didn't act decisively, public trust in the police force would be severely damaged. The suspension was the first step in addressing this mistake, but McCrae also knew that this was just the beginning of a thorough investigation. The suspended officers not only faced the loss of their jobs, but also had to endure an internal investigation into their actions. This was not a light disciplinary measure like those they had faced before, but a clear reflection of the severity of their behavior. When officers are suspended, it means their actions have crossed the boundaries of the law, and they must face serious consequences. Especially in this case, the racial discrimination and abuse of power had eroded public trust in the police force. The suspended officers would face a serious investigation, and if enough evidence was found, they could be subjected to harsher disciplinary action. However, McCrae understood that this was not a personal punishment, but the first step in reforming the police force to prevent such mistakes from happening in the future. With each suspension decision, McCrae felt the tension in his heart. As a police chief, he had to balance protecting the police force with upholding justice. This incident not only affected the officers directly involved, but also had a broader impact on the entire force. McCrae knew that his decisions would have far-reaching consequences. And it wasn't just the suspended officers who would face scrutiny, but the entire police force would have to undergo stricter examination in the coming days. The public outrage was not just a typical criticism, it was a strong and serious demand for change. Human rights organizations, the witnesses, and even politicians had spoken out calling for reform in the police force. McCrae could not allow the police force to continue in a state where racism and abuse of power could happen unchecked. When the officers were suspended, McCrae felt a part of the responsibility rested with him, but he also knew that if he didn't act immediately, public trust in the police would completely collapse. This not only harmed the careers of the suspended officers, but also eroded public confidence in law enforcement. McCrae was keenly aware that change in the police force was unavoidable, and he had to face it decisively. The suspended officers would have to answer not only to internal scrutiny, but also to public oversight. This was part of the reform process McCrae hoped would make the police force more transparent and fairer in the future. The suspension of the officers was a necessary step, but McCrae knew that one action alone would not solve the issues of racism and abuse of power in the force. He needed to do more, and the first step was to ensure that this incident would not be overlooked. The investigation had to be carried out fairly and transparently, and the officers would have to undergo strict scrutiny from the authorities and the community. This was the moment for the police force to change, and McCrae could not let this incident become just another isolated event in a system that had existed for too long. Immediate reflection and action were the only ways to restore public trust. This suspension was not just an administrative decision, but the first step in a larger struggle. The struggle for justice, for transparency in law enforcement, and for fairness for all. McCrae understood that the change couldn't stop here, and everyone in the police force would have to work to rebuild public trust in the legal system. Change would not happen overnight, but with this suspension decision, McCrae hoped that one day the police force would stand firm in an enforce justice more fairly. The leadership of the police force could not escape the mounting pressure falling on their shoulders. Chief McCrae, after receiving the directive to suspend the two officers, now had to face not only public criticism but also difficult questions about the police system and how justice was being enforced. The officers involved were now not only suspended but also under strict supervision by investigative authorities. Their actions were being closely examined not just in the context of this incident but throughout their entire careers. The public, having witnessed the racism and abuse of power, continued to demand sweeping reforms within the police force. Each passing day, the pressure on Chief McCrae and the leaders of the force grew as human rights organizations, politicians, and community leaders all called for a deep and systemic change. People were no longer satisfied with apologies or the usual justifications from the police. They wanted real action, a reform that would restore public trust in the justice system. This change was no longer just the demand of a small group, but of the entire community, the marginalized and oppressed who had long suffered, now demanding a truly fair justice system. Meanwhile, Ryan Miller, the young officer directly involved in the wrongful arrest, was facing the consequences of his actions, which he could no longer control. In the days following the incident, Ryan tried to stay calm, continue working, and carry out his duties as usual. But as each day passed, the pressure from public opinion grew heavier. He noticed that his colleagues, those around him, were looking at him differently. These glances were not direct criticism, but they were filled with hesitation and distrust. The atmosphere in the unit became increasingly tense, and Ryan knew he was being watched. Brief conversations in the locker room, silent stares during meetings, all made him feel the difference. He began to realize that his mistakes could no longer be hidden. Every comment online, every conversation on forums, all criticized him and his colleagues. Ryan couldn't stop thinking about what he had done. He felt an increasing lack of confidence, a fear that wouldn't go away. The decisions he made in a moment of haste were now turning into nightmares. He couldn't escape the feeling that he had done wrong, and this was having a powerful impact on his career. Moreover, Ryan began to feel deep regret. He wondered if there was any way to go back to fix his mistakes, but everything seemed to have spiraled out of control. The feelings of regret, the doubt over his decision, all crashed down on him like an unrelenting storm. Marcus's gaze, his silence, felt like a reminder that Marcus had done the right thing while Ryan had not. And that feeling, the feeling of having done wrong, could not be erased. As Ryan faced investigations and interviews from his superiors, he felt an increasing sense of unease. Each question, each glance from his colleagues and superiors made him feel as if he were being exposed. He was no longer the confident officer he once was. The public outrage, the criticism from human rights organizations and the community made it unbearable for him. With each passing day, he felt himself sinking deeper into a pit he couldn't escape. Every moment, Ryan had to confront the reality that he had not only lost everyone's trust, but was also facing consequences he had never imagined. He felt unable to control the situation, and that only intensified the anxiety building within him. With each step forward, Ryan felt the regret and lack of confidence growing. He couldn't forget the moment when Marcus, an FBI agent, stood there and with one simple statement changed everything. Marcus's silence, not resisting yet remaining calm, was a warning to Ryan about the racism in law enforcement. Not only did it make him feel like the loser in this confrontation, but it also forced him to reassess the entire process he had been a part of. More than ever, Ryan felt the shortcomings within himself and the police force shortcomings he couldn't immediately fix. The pressure from public opinion and the government continued to grow, and Ryan realized there was no turning back to the past. He had to face the truth and accept responsibility. The public criticism, the ongoing investigations, and the community's outrage could not be stopped. But most importantly, Ryan had to face himself. The anxiety within him couldn't be untangled. and he had to learn to live with the mistakes he had made. That feeling seemed inescapable, and the regret only grew larger, becoming a dark shadow in his life. The investigation continued to progress, but the events surrounding Marcus' wrongful arrest kept raising significant questions. Investigators began gathering all available evidence from witness videos and reports from the officers at the scene. The videos, which captured Officer Ryan's actions from when he first instructed Marcus to stop to when he asserted his FBI identity, became key witnesses in revealing the truth. These images not only depicted a simple wrongdoing but also exposed the racism that the young officer had unconsciously displayed. Investigators not only relied on witness testimony but also examined every angle of the incident through the video footage, where Marcus showed no signs of resistance or defiance. The footage was not only evidence of the officer's actions but also a mirror reflecting the corruption within the police force. The video quickly spread widely, becoming an essential part of the investigation. Comments from the community, from human rights organizations to individuals affected by racism, continually pushed the investigation forward. The people who had witnessed the incident became undeniable witnesses. Throughout the investigation, investigators spent hours reviewing the video, analyzing every detail, looking for critical points that could prove the police abuse of power. The images and sounds in the video helped clearly define the officer's wrongdoing, while also showing that Marcus had not exhibited any signs of violation. Meanwhile, the corruption within the police system began to emerge as investigators accessed internal records. Similar cases that had occurred but were never properly addressed started to surface as part of a bigger picture. Reports of overlooked incidents and the past cases of racism ignored were gradually being uncovered. This left investigators stunned as they realized that Marcus's case, though serious, was just a small part of a vast system of injustice. Previous cases, despite clear evidence of racial discrimination in police conduct, had been ignored and not handled properly. Reports of abuse of power and racial discrimination had been documented but had never been given the attention or seriousness they deserved. Just as human rights organizations had warned, the internal system of the police force had undeniable flaws, a system where such misconduct was repeated without severe punishment. These revelations made the investigation even more complicated. The issue wasn't just about clarifying Marcus's case. It expanded to questioning how the police force had treated citizens, particularly those from minority communities. The investigators faced a system that had been designed to protect those within the force, and now they had to expose the flaws that the system could not self-correct. The investigation was not just about one officer's mistake, but about the entire police force now being placed under intense scrutiny. The investigators could not ignore the clear evidence, and they knew that without implementing comprehensive reform, all their efforts would be in vain. Past mistakes were gradually coming to light, and changing the system would not be easy. The reports and documents that had been overlooked in the past now became crucial parts of the investigation. The investigators began to realize that the issue wasn't just with one individual, but with a system that had been structured to protect wrongdoing. The police force for a long time had become a closed circle where mistakes were never properly addressed. And as the truth about similar incidents was concealed, public trust in the justice system was weakened. This made the investigation even more complicated, as the investigators realized they weren't just uncovering a case of abuse of power, but opening up a bigger story about a lack of accountability and transparency within the police. With the new evidence gathered, the investigators prepared to present their findings in an important meeting. What had started as a personal case had now evolved into a profound social issue. This investigation was not only about addressing one mistake, but also about waking up a society that had become too accustomed to injustice. The police system needed to change, and those who abused power would have to face consequences they could not avoid. But in these meetings, the investigators felt the contradiction between what the system sought to protect and provided what society needed. The big question that everyone began asking was whether the police force had the courage to change itself, or would it continue to protect the mistakes of the past. The investigators continued to delve into the documents, videos, and reports related to Marcus's wrongful arrest. But as they continued their work, a truth slowly emerged. The Marcus incident wasn't the first in the police force. In fact, many similar cases had been hidden for years. Investigators discovered that in the records they gathered there were numerous reports of racial discrimination and abuse of power within the police force that had never been properly addressed. Incidents had been erased, not documented, or even covered up with falsified reports. This only fueled the growing outrage among the public and human rights organizations. There was no longer any doubt racial discrimination in the police force was not a rare occurrence, but a part of the working culture in certain departments. The community began to realize that the police system which they had once trusted was concealing major mistakes and wrongful actions that no one dared to expose. This made the investigators feel that they were not just dealing with an isolated incident, but a much broader and more complex issue. Racial discrimination within the police force was not a simple problem that could be resolved overnight. This system had existed for years with gaps and mechanisms protecting officers' wrongful conduct, leaving victims of oppression unable to speak out. When evidence of these concealed incidents emerged, investigators couldn't help but feel outraged. Why weren't these mistakes addressed from the start? Why had the police system allowed these acts of racism and abuse of power to persist for so long? Everyone began to realize that for a long time, fairness had been overlooked and the oppressed had suffered in silence. Meanwhile, the community could no longer remain idle. Civil rights organizations and citizen advocacy groups began pushing for a comprehensive reform in the police force. They demanded widespread changes not just in handling cases like Marcus's, but an overhaul in the entire operational process of the police. Transparency, a crucial element in rebuilding public trust in the police, became the top demand of these organizations. Human rights groups called on the government to implement a broad reform, including establishing independent oversight mechanisms to ensure that police actions would no longer be blindly protected. The community began to react more strongly than ever. Protests broke out not only in the city where the incident occurred, but across the country. Those who had been oppressed, who had faced racial discrimination by the police along with human rights organizations, stood up demanding justice. They called for a strong reform demanding change in how the police force operated, from training officers to altering recruitment processes and increasing oversight of police actions. They insisted that officers who abuse their power be held accountable and that justice be applied fairly. Each protest was not merely an act of opposition, but a call for deep systemic change in how the police treated its citizens. With support from international organizations and momentum from the community, calls for reform began to be embraced in political dialogues. The government could no longer ignore the public's outrage and the demands from human rights groups. People called for a comprehensive investigation into the police force and demanded that the government take strong measures to change how this institution operated. From seminars and official meetings to street protests, all attention was focused on the issue of racism and abuse of power within the police force. The community demanded that the officers who violated their authority be held accountable and that necessary measures be taken to reform the police department. Society knew that change couldn't happen overnight, but with the unity of the community and the strong support from human rights organizations, police reform began to take shape. Discussions about this change were no longer just words. They had become tangible actions of a society fighting for justice and equality. Justice could not be delayed, and changes within the police force could not be stopped. The community's outrage created immense pressure, forcing the government to face the demand for reform that could no longer be postponed. The community had spoken, and now they could not back down. The community could not remain passive in the face of what had happened. Human rights organizations began calling for an investigation that went beyond Marcus's wrongful arrest, expanding to cover all similar cases within police departments. They demanded a thorough investigation, one that didn't simply stop at an isolated incident, but re-examine the entire process of justice and power enforcement within law enforcement. These organizations knew that if it remained limited to just one case, everything would quickly be forgotten. Only when the investigation was expanded and all cases of abuse of power and racial discrimination in the police force were brought to light could society hope for real reform. These organizations called for strict and transparent measures with no exceptions, no cover-ups for abusive behavior. They emphasized that only when the authorities truly took responsibility and confronted the mistakes in law enforcement could public trust in the justice system be rebuilt. Alongside the demands from large organizations, the community began speaking out more strongly. Citizens, those who had been directly or indirectly affected by racism and abuse of power at the hands of the police, now boldly shared their own stories. They had gone through situations similar to Marcus, but in the past they hadn't had the voice to speak up. Now, with the widespread sharing of Marcus's arrest video, they saw that the opportunity for change had come. Community reports, witness testimonies, and the stories they shared became powerful evidence in the fight for justice. People weren't just speaking out on social media, they were also actively participating in public dialogues about racism within the police force. The video, shot right at the scene, became clear evidence of racism in police actions. The witnesses to the incident were no longer just bystanders, but had become important witnesses, people the system could no longer ignore. The evidence from the community not only came from the videos of the arrest, but also from reports of similar incidents that had not been properly addressed before. Citizens began recounting their experiences with the police, from violations of personal rights, discriminatory treatment, to being detained without valid reasons. These stories were not merely personal complaints, but clear evidence of injustice in law enforcement practices. They argued that this injustice had become part of the system where mistakes were never dealt with seriously. Their reports and stories, along with videos exposing police misconduct, created a powerful wave. The truth, though uncomfortable, was now exposed to the light, and nothing could be hidden anymore. This only increased the tension within the community and the police force. Everything had gone beyond a dialogue between individuals and had become a major struggle, demanding comprehensive reform within the police force. Human rights organizations were not just calling for justice for one person, but for all those who had suffered from discrimination and abuse of power. The reports and stories from the community had painted a clear picture of the deep-rooted issues within the police force, issues that could no longer be ignored. These organizations became the driving force for greater change, demanding that the government not only handle the case superficially, but confront the entire system that had long concealed racial discrimination in the administration of justice. With each story told, with each video shared, the community grew stronger and demanded a fair investigation and real reform. Criticism of the police and the legal system intensified. The groups that had been oppressed for so long were no longer just victims. They became fighters, actively speaking out and demanding justice. They insisted that not only should the individuals responsible be held accountable, but that the legal system itself should be able to protect every citizen regardless of race or ethnicity. The awakening from the community further fueled this reform movement, and no one within the police system could ignore these demands. The stories from the community helped make the picture of racism within the police clearer than ever. It wasn't just Marcus's video, but also the evidence from other citizens that exposed the racism and abuse of power that had long been hidden within the system. From that point on, the community could no longer stay silent. They stood up demanding change, and no one could deny the truth. Public opinion continued to ramp up pressure on the officers following the wrongful arrest of Marcus. Once the incident spread, a wave of strong criticism from the public hit the police force. Human rights organizations, civil rights groups, and affected individuals continually called for harsh punishment for the officers involved. The calls for reform not only focused on handling Marcus' case, but also intensified the demand for changes to the entire police system. The community began to realize that racism and abuse of power could no longer be tolerated within the police. They demanded major reform, from changes in police training and recruitment to establishing independent oversight mechanisms to protect citizens' rights. Public criticism not only condemned the actions of the officers, but also targeted the entire legal system, demanding transparency and true justice. The public no longer accepted vague apologies or unfounded justifications. They demanded concrete and decisive actions from the authority. Under the pressure of the community, Ryan Miller, the young officer directly involved in the wrongful arrest, began to face unavoidable consequences. Amid the growing outrage from the public, Ryan felt as though he was being surrounded. Articles criticizing him continuously appeared in the media, and public discussions on racism within the police force became increasingly intense. From social media dialogues to public meetings, all eyes were on him, demanding that he take responsibility for his actions. Ryan could not avoid the feeling of being isolated, as if everyone around him was turning their back on him. Despite being a young officer, he now had to face severe consequences he had never imagined. His colleagues in the force also began to look at him different. No longer the respect he once had, their gazes were filled with suspicion, many of them feeling that his actions had tarnished the reputation of the entire department. Not only was he being publicly criticized, but Ryan was also threatened with losing his job. Calls from his superiors became increasingly tense, and pressure from the government grew stronger. Ryan began receiving notifications about an internal investigation and was asked to cooperate by providing information. However, he could not escape the feeling of guilt, especially when he heard sharp criticisms from citizens' human rights organizations and the very community he had once protected. They not only wanted him to lose his job, but also demanded that he face personal lawsuits from Marcus and others affected. The footage from the video witness testimonies all pointed to Ryan's wrongful actions, and he had to be held accountable for this mistake. Human rights organizations publicly called for personal lawsuits against him, demanding compensation for the emotional distress Marcus had endured. Not only did Ryan risk losing his job, but he also faced an uncertain future with the potential of having to pay a significant amount in damages. The pressure from the public and the collapse of his self-confidence gradually caused Ryan to unravel. He could not stop thinking about the consequences he had caused. Sleepless nights, nightmares about the incident haunted his mind, and every time he looked in the mirror, he could no longer recognize himself. The image of Marcus, his resilience and silence throughout the process, constantly lingered in his mind as a reminder. Ryan could not deny that he had made a serious mistake, and the more he faced the outrage of the community, the more he felt himself pushed into a dark corner. He could not escape these consequences, and the regret in his heart made him feel desperate. The image of Marcus remained an undeniable symbol of fairness and equality, while he, a young police officer, had become a prime example of the mistakes that could occur within the police force. The feelings of loss, lack of confidence, and inevitable confusion made Ryan a completely different person from who he had been before the incident. While Ryan felt like he was completely falling apart, the community continued to speak out. Civil rights organizations, community leaders, and even ordinary citizens did not just want an apology, but but demanded strong actions. They wanted real change, and they would not tolerate police abuse of power in any form. For them, Marcus's case was just part of a larger story, and they could not back down until all the wrongdoings within the police force were fully addressed. While Ryan felt the collapse within himself, the community found strength in their fight for justice. The calls for reform continued to rise, and protests continued to occur regularly. No one could stop fighting for their rights, especially when the mistakes within the police force persisted. The outrage from the community and pressure from human rights organizations forced the government to take action. Following Marcus's case and the public's strong calls for reform, the government decided to implement comprehensive changes within the police force. Although the officers involved had been suspended, the root problems within the police system could not be resolved by temporary measures. The government understood that to regain public trust, significant changes were needed from recruitment processes to the oversight of officers' conduct. The proposed reforms aimed to ensure that the police force would not only serve as a tool for law enforcement, but also protect the rights of all citizens, regardless of race or background. A special committee was formed to review all police procedures. This was not just an ordinary investigation, but a comprehensive review with the goal of uncovering the flaws in the system. Public discussions on reform began to take place nationwide. The government invited experts, civil rights organizations, and the public to participate in the process to ensure that every aspect of the police force would be thoroughly examined. These discussions focused not only on handling specific cases, but also on rebuilding public trust in the police force. The reform would not stop at process changes, but would also address how the police interacted with the community, particularly with minority groups. The proposed reforms included changes in how police officers were recruited and trained. The recruitment process would be improved to ensure that only candidates with strong ethical standards and the ability to enforce justice fairly would join the force. Training would focus not only on law enforcement skills, but also on communication stress management and, most importantly, awareness of racial discrimination. Trainers would also undergo programs on social issues to help officers improve their understanding and respect for human rights. Additionally, police conduct would be more closely monitored through independent oversight mechanisms. External organizations would have the authority to review and assess police actions while transparently handling complaints from the community. This was a critical step in the reform process, aimed not only at addressing current issues but also preventing future mistakes. These proposals received strong support from human rights organizations who had been involved in the long-standing fight for police reform. However, there was also significant opposition, especially from within the police force. They felt that these reform measures were an infringement on their power and credibility. These individuals believed that such changes could undermine their ability to protect citizens and maintain order. However, the pressure from the public and the outrage over instances of abuse of power made the demands for reform undeniable. Public discussions were not limited to political meetings, but spread across communities. At community gatherings, people continuously spoke out for a fairer police system where every citizen would have the right to protection and be treated equally, without racial or color-based discrimination. These dialogues created a space for the pain and injustices in society to be understood and addressed. From this, many initiatives were proposed to improve the relationship between the police and the community, such as trust-building programs, meetings between police and minority communities, and policies reflecting diversity within the police force. Despite the opposition, the reform process continued. Human rights organizations and the community did not back down, continuing to put pressure on the government and the police force to ensure that the reform measures would be implemented seriously and effectively. Reform was not just a demand for changes within the police system, but a fight to restore justice for all those who had been discriminated against, overlooked, and inadequately protected for many years. It was from these dialogues that the community gradually realized that only when everyone stood up, when no one remained silent in the face of injustice, could real change happen. Although these reforms would not be completed overnight, they opened a new path where justice would be enforced more fairly, and no one would have to suffer discrimination or abuse of power anymore. The community and the government joined forces to rebuild the police system, and though many challenges lay ahead, this step was necessary to create a fairer and more equal society for all. Even though the police reform was presented with strong measures, not everyone in the police force agreed with these changes. Many senior officers who had been accustomed to power and control throughout their careers expressed strong opposition. They believed that the reforms would diminish their authority, preventing them from enforcing the law as freely as before. These officers felt that their power was essential for maintaining order and protecting the community, and that implementing the reforms would weaken them, making it difficult to respond to tense situations promptly. They feared that increased oversight would hinder their ability to make quick decisions in emergencies, where delays could pose risks to both police officers and the public. However, despite the opposition within the force, the pressure from the community could not be ignored. The public, with the support of human rights organizations, community leaders, and all those who had witnessed discrimination and abuse of power, continued to push for reform. All eyes were on the government and the police force, and the community relentlessly demanded real change. Protests continued, and human rights organizations urged the government to take action. The public's outrage could not be extinguished, and in this context, the police force had no choice but to comply. While not all police officers agreed with the changes, they understood that this was the time for the police to set an example, accepting adjustments if they wanted to maintain public trust. This did not mean they would lose power, but they would have to take greater responsibility for the power they held. While the opposition within the force simmered, Martin did not participate in the reform. He remained silent, not speaking out or engaging in public discussions. Although he knew that change within the police force would not be easy, he did not feel the need to speak up. For him, the struggle was not about an individual or a specific system, but about a fairer society, where every citizen, regardless of skin color or race, had the right to be treated fairly. Martin understood that the reform would not happen overnight and would face many challenges, but he also knew that every significant change required a process of hardship and struggle. What he had done was open a dialogue and opportunity for issues that had long been hidden within the police force to come to light. He did not feel the need to participate in debates or become a public symbol, as his silence spoke volumes. Martin continued to observe the developments of the reform from afar, knowing that this change would not happen quickly or easily. He did not expect immediate results, but he hoped that at least the reform would mark a turning point in how the police force enforces justice. This change was not meant to please an individual or a group, but to restore public trust in the legal system, where fairness is not overlooked and where no one suffers from discrimination or abuse of power. Martin realized that this struggle would be long and challenging, but he also knew that it was the silence and perseverance of the community that would be the deciding factor. He did not need to be the leader, but the change had begun, and that was the most important thing. After a long period of investigation and evidence gathering, the police officers involved in the wrongful arrest of Marcus Reed were finally held accountable for their actions. Specifically, Ryan Miller, the young officer, along with his colleagues involved in the incident, were convicted of abuse of power and racial discrimination. This decision was not only the result of a singular incident, but also a significant step in addressing the deeper issues within the police force. force. The conviction of Ryan and the other officers sent a powerful message: no one is allowed to misuse their power to harm others, and all wrongful actions must be held accountable. This was not just a victory for Marcus, but for justice, transparency, and human rights. Ryan and the officers involved not only faced criticism within the community, but also had to deal with severe punishments. Being convicted of abuse of power and racial discrimination was not just a professional penalty, but a turning point in their lives. These punishments were not merely suspensions or reprimands. They were a clear reflection of the seriousness of the actions they had taken. Ryan, who had once been proud to be part of the police force, could no longer stand among them. He was banned from working in law enforcement, a punishment that affected not only his career, but his entire life. This was a punishment no officer had ever thought they would endure, but it was the price that Ryan and his colleagues had to pay for their irresponsibility and abuse of power on the job. In addition to being banned from law enforcement, Ryan faced a civil lawsuit from Marcus Reed. The emotional damages Marcus suffered due to the racial discrimination and abuse of power by the police could not be compensated by a simple apology or administrative penalty. Things had gone too far, and now Ryan had to face legal consequences. Each day, the pressure from the lawsuit grew, and Ryan knew his life would never be the same. Interviews, interrogations by lawyers, and court hearings created a life of constant tension that he could not escape. The sharp questions from Marcus's lawyer, the undeniable evidence, all proved that Ryan and the other officers had made a grave mistake. Not only Ryan, but the entire police force was strongly criticized throughout the investigation and trial. This conviction also served as a warning to all other officers in the force. Irresponsibility and racial discrimination could no longer exist in a police force that the public needed to trust. The police officers involved in this incident have paid the price for their wrongdoing, and whether they want it or not, their careers have come to an end. The police cannot hide their mistakes in cases like this, and they must be held accountable for what they have done. This is a crucial step in making it clear that mistakes within the police force will never be overlooked, and officers who abuse their power must face the consequences. Ultimately, the conviction of Ryan and the other officers is not just about addressing a specific incident, but is part of a larger reform process within the police force. It sends a strong message to all law enforcement agencies that power is not an excuse for abuse and discrimination. Only when the police force truly stands on a foundation of fairness and transparency can public trust be restored. While this conviction may bring hardship to the individuals involved, it is a significant change that opens the door for reform within the police and ensures that past mistakes will not be repeated. Although the investigation's results have been recognized and the two officers involved in Marcus's wrongful arrest have been convicted, the public cannot be completely satisfied with just these disciplinary decisions. Human rights organizations and civil rights groups continue to demand a comprehensive reform of the police force. Convicting the officers is only a small part of a much larger issue that society must confront. The public wants to see real changes, not only in isolated incidents, but throughout the entire system. Reforms must be implemented to prevent similar mistakes in the future. The demands from the community do not stop at holding the offending officers accountable, but also include overhauling the entire way the police force operates. The citizens involved in the protests and public discussions do not want just a symbolic decision. They demand a police system that is truly fair, transparent, and able to protect every citizen equally, regardless of race or ethnicity. Those calling for justice not only want to see punishment for the officers' misconduct, but also want to witness real change in the police force's procedures and training. While the conviction of the officers involved has brought some satisfaction to the community, it is only a part of the long struggle for justice. The public will not accept stopping there. They know know that real change will need to be driven more comprehensively with specific measures to address the long-standing issues within the police force. Human rights organizations and those fighting for justice continue to push for broad reforms, including enhanced oversight, changes in police recruitment and training processes, and the establishment of an independent monitoring system to protect citizens' rights. Meanwhile, Police Chief McCrae, who had been responsible for the entire operation of the police department, could not escape the strong criticism. The event not only harmed the officers involved, but also forced the police force to confront a major crisis of public trust. Organizations, from human rights groups to political factions, began intensifying demands for McCrae to be held accountable for his failure to control the actions of his subordinate officers. While he might argue that it was impossible to oversee every action of each individual officer, the public disagreed. They believed that it was McCrae's responsibility to ensure that every officer was properly trained and tightly controlled, preventing misconduct and abuse of power like the arrest of Marcus. The pressure on McCrae intensified as human rights organizations and the community demanded that he face the consequences of his failure to control his officers. Not only was he being criticized by the public, but he was also facing a series of investigations regarding his inability to prevent his officers' misconduct. Questions about his leadership abilities started to mount. Meetings with superiors became more tense, and McCrae found himself in a situation he could no longer avoid. Despite having implemented certain controls within the department, the incident revealed that those measures were insufficient. Especially with mistakes occurring right under his nose, he could not avoid responsibility. The community and human rights organizations continued to pressure McCrae, demanding he take accountability for the failure to maintain discipline within the police force. They argued that McCrae, as the head, was not only responsible for how officers were trained, but also for how violations within the department were not properly addressed. Criticism toward him became more intense, and many began questioning his ability to lead. His next decisions would determine whether he could continue in his role and whether the police force could restore public trust. Despite the criticism, McCrae knew that reform within the police force was inevitable. Change was necessary, and whether he liked it or not, he had to face the issues within the department. The public had spoken out, and he could no longer maintain a system that was uncontrollable. While he could not please everyone, McCrae understood that the most important thing now was to confront the truth and make the necessary changes to restore trust in the community. After a series of shocking events, the government finally had to acknowledge that the police force had revealed serious shortcomings, and a major change was unavoidable. Incidents like the wrongful arrest of Marcus had made it impossible for the public to stay silent, forcing political leaders to act. The public spoke out, demanding a comprehensive reform in the police force, and the government could no longer ignore that pressure. These demands were not merely calls for punishment for the offending officers, but a call for deep structural changes in how the police force operates. Though initially hesitant, the government realized that in order to protect the safety and rights of citizens, they needed to implement strong and effective reforms. Past mistakes could no longer be repeated, and the police force had to face its responsibilities. With the determination to restore public trust, reform measures were introduced, starting with improving the police recruitment and training processes. New legislation was passed outlining clearer standards for recruitment, requiring police candidates to meet a set of specific ethical and competency criteria. Those entering the force not only needed the ability to enforce the law, but also had to be trained to understand human rights, communicate effectively, and handle tense situations in a civil manner. The new training courses would focus not only on professional skills, but also on lessons about multiculturalism, respecting diversity in the community, and sensitive issues like racial discrimination. These were crucial changes to help officers enforce justice without causing harm to those they were entrusted to protect. At the same time, the government decided to enhance external oversight oversight of the police force. Independent oversight agencies would be established to monitor police activities, helping to control power and ensuring that misconduct was detected and addressed promptly. Human rights organizations and community groups would be invited to participate in discussions and oversee police activities, thus increasing transparency and fairness in law enforcement. External oversight would ensure that no abuses of power could be covered up and all allegations would be taken seriously. This was a vital step in rebuilding the police force, ensuring that it would become a tool for upholding justice rather than an entity that abused its power. Additionally, new laws clearly defined how misconduct in the police force would be handled, requiring officers to be accountable not only to their superiors but also to the community. Measures to protect citizens' rights would also be enforced more vigorously to ensure that human rights were respected in every situation. The government affirmed that while the police force is an essential part of maintaining public order, it must also be subject to strict oversight to prevent abuses of power. This is why the reform measures are not just a demand from the public, but also a crucial part of rebuilding the community's trust in the police force. This reform is not easy, and it cannot be completed overnight. However, it is the first step in a long process to restore trust and respect for the police force. The government and the community understand that this reform will face opposition from those within the force who feel threatened by these changes. However, those fighting for justice and equality know that this is the only way to ensure that the mistakes of the past will never happen again. To build a fair and transparent justice system, the police force cannot continue to protect wrongdoing, but must proactively change and implement reform measures. This is a significant challenge, but also an opportunity for the police force to demonstrate that they can uphold justice fairly for everyone regardless of race, religion, or background. After the government began implementing reform measures, international human rights organizations quickly recognized the importance of participating in this process. These organizations, which have long fought for human rights and justice, could not remain passive as this crucial change unfolded. They understood that reforming the police force is a necessary but challenging step, and for true success, these measures need to be closely monitored from the outside. International organizations have joined in supporting the government and community in overseeing the reform process, ensuring that the new procedures and measures are not just theoretical, but are seriously enforced in practice. These organizations not only provide advice, but also offer resources, expertise, and legal support to help ensure that the reforms do not go off track. They emphasize that the success of this reform will be measured by real change in the police force, where every citizen has the right to be protected, fairly free from discrimination or abuse of power. With the involvement of international organizations, the reform process has become stronger than ever. These organizations have pushed for the creation of independent oversight mechanisms where misconduct can be detected and addressed promptly. This not only enhances transparency within the police force, but also helps rebuild public trust in the legal system. International human rights organizations have also been the first to call for and implement social surveys gathering data from affected communities to ensure that every aspect of the reform is properly executed. This has provided organizations, authorities, and the government with a clearer understanding of the real situation within the police force and how reforms need to be applied to achieve fairness. While international organizations and authorities are intensifying the reform efforts, Martin continues to support the fight for justice that he initiated. Though he doesn't directly participate in discussions about reforms or public interviews, Martin remains silent and refrains from speaking out about the process. He doesn't feel the need to lead this reform, but he continues to observe and support human rights organizations in overseeing the change. Martin understands that this fight is not just his, but belongs to everyone who has been discriminated against and abused over the years. He doesn't join the reform through speeches or statements, but he continues to support human rights organizations in monitoring and evaluating the implementation of the reform measures. For him, it is crucial that real change comes from the community, from those who have been oppressed, and from the organizations fighting for justice. Martin knows that this change will not be easy and will face many obstacles. However, he still believes that every step, no matter how small, will have a significant impact on society. He also understands that these reforms cannot be completed immediately, but with the participation of the community and the close supervision of international organizations, society will gradually move toward true justice. Although he doesn't speak out much, Martin is quietly supporting these discussions and struggles. He knows that reform within the police force is necessary, and while the process may take time, it will open up a fairer future for everyone. Martin's silence is not abandonment, but a firm belief that only when the community unites and fights for justice can true change occur. In Martin's eyes, this struggle is not about him, but about a better society where justice is served without discrimination. He does not participate in the reform because he believes that it is the oppressed and the community who will lead this change. What matters is that action must come from everyone, from organizations, individuals, and even authorities. Martin continues to observe the change from afar, not participating in debates, but still contributing to the reform in his own quiet way. After the case was concluded, Martin no longer felt that he was merely someone standing up for his own justice. He realized that his case was just a small part of a larger system where racism and injustice still persist in many forms. He began to reflect that not only the police force, but society as a whole needed to change the way they perceive and treat every citizen. Justice does not only come from addressing misconduct in the police force, but must also start from a strong societal foundation, from education to daily social norms. For real change to take root, every individual, community, and organization must learn to recognize and treat each other more fairly. The seemingly small things which greatly influence how society operates can no longer be ignored. Martin recognized that to build a truly just society, the first step is to change the mindset of future generations on racism and human rights. One important step he saw as necessary was reforming education. Programs on racism, human rights, and mutual respect must be integrated into school curricula from elementary to university levels. Teaching children and teenagers about these issues will not only help them recognize the injustices present in society, but will also equip them with the tools to fight for a fair society. The important thing is to start with education, where values like equality, human rights, respect, and unity can be encouraged and develop. Education reform should not only stop at schools, but also extend to social organizations and community groups. These organizations, from human rights groups to community support groups, need to collaborate with educational institutions to organize training sessions, workshops, and awareness campaigns on racism and human rights. Especially these programs should be designed not only for younger people, but also for adults who may not fully understand the impact of discrimination on society. This will help build a community that is self-aware and capable of changing its behavior, creating a positive transformation in society. Never before has social change been as necessary as it is now. Issues of racism and abuse of power not only affect one individual or one group of people, but have spread throughout the entire community. Therefore, reform must not only be the effort of the police force, but must involve all levels of society. The entire society must come together to create an environment where everyone, regardless of race, religion, or background can live in respect and equality. These changes will undoubtedly not be easy, but Martin believes that every small step forward will create a broader impact. Reforming the police force is just a part of the bigger picture, and this change must go hand in hand with changing society's perceptions and actions regarding deeper issues. True justice is not just about prosecuting criminals, but about building a society where everyone is treated fairly from the moment they are born. Martin understands that only when society changes, when education and social organizations work together to create an equal foundation, will mistakes like Marcus's ever happen again. He's not just a man who was wrongly arrested. He is part of an ongoing struggle for a more just society. And from struggles like these, reforms in education and society will blossom, leading to a better future for everyone. The events that took place not only forced an individual to face significant consequences, but also sparked deep changes in the community's perception. Those who have been racially discriminated against those who have endured injustice for so long began to take part in dialogues about justice and equality. Previously, they may have felt powerless, voiceless in society, but now they were no longer silent. Human rights organizations, civil rights communities, and those who had been oppressed were no longer just victims. They had become strong advocates for their rights. They started speaking out in public discussions about racial discrimination and existing social issues, opening up deep dialogues on how society needs to change to truly be just for everyone. Their participation in these dialogues was not just simple resistance. It was an important step in the process of transforming social awareness. The discussions became increasingly lively, drawing the attention of many, not just in the oppressed community, but also among other groups. People began to see more clearly the injustices they were previously unaware of. The stories and experiences of those discriminated against were no longer considered private matters, but became clear evidence of the injustices society as a whole needed to confront. From there, awareness of fairness, equality, and human rights was widely discussed, becoming not just an issue for the oppressed, but for everyone in society. Martin was not the hero in this story. He did not stand up with the goal of becoming a symbol, nor did he try to create an image for himself. He was simply a man who stood up against the injustice he had experienced, but his actions became the catalyst for change in an entire community. Although Martin did not speak publicly about the reform or participate in protests, his silence became a powerful message of resolve and respect for human rights. His actions inspired many, sparking in them the belief that they could change society, that they had the right to live in equality and justice. It was Martin, through his silence and composure, who created a powerful wave of change within the community, where those who had once been silent now stood up. Not everyone can do what Martin did. Not everyone can face injustice without reacting loudly. But his actions showed that change does not always have to come from loud voices or prominence. Sometimes it is the calmness, the determination in one's actions that can create lasting change. Martin did not need to become a symbol because he already was one, through what he did, through how he faced injustice, without letting it strip away his dignity. He did not ask for recognition, but he made the whole community rethink the core values of society. Martin's actions were not only the beginning of change within the police force, but also a sign of a profound shift in social awareness about human rights and equality. Public discussions about justice, racism, and human rights were no longer issues for the oppressed alone, but had become societal concerns. From these discussions, the community gradually realized that fairness can not only be built through government decisions, but must be created through the awareness and actions of every individual in society. People like Martin, though not speaking much, have a power in their actions stronger than any words. His story ignited in everyone the belief in change, that anyone can be part of the fight for justice, no matter who they are. The protests demanding justice did not stop in one city or a specific area, but quickly spread across large and small cities nationwide. People from all walks of life, young and old, stood up to express their anger against racism in the legal system. Each protest, each chant shouted was not just a protest against an event, but a call for change in a system that had long allowed racism and abuse of power to exist. The police, once seen as protectors of justice, had now become a symbol of injustice in the eyes of many. The protesters wanted not only to see changes in the police force, but also a reform of the entire legal system where justice must be administered fairly regardless of race or ethnicity. They understood that without this change, racial discrimination would continue, and no one would be there to protect their rights. Unity within the civil rights community grew stronger. Human rights organizations, activists, and especially the Black community began to unite to continue the fight for equality. Public discussions, conferences, and protests attracted not only those affected by racism, but also many other groups who wanted to see a fair and equal society for all. Together, they pushed for reform, demanding changes not only within the police force, but also across all sectors of society. They didn't want forgiveness for past mistakes, but concrete actions to stop racial discrimination and abuse of power within the system. The Black community, with the pain and discrimination they had endured, became a powerful force for this struggle. No longer individuals fighting alone, they realized that change could only happen when they united facing injustice together and demanding their rights. It was this unity that created an unstoppable strength. Civil rights organizations and activists no longer fought alone, but had strong support from the community. They intensified their campaigns, promoted dialogues on justice and human rights, and constantly created movements to raise awareness about racial discrimination in society. They were not only fighting for their own rights, but for a fair society where everyone could live without fear of being treated unjustly because of their skin color. As the protests continued, the powerful voices calling out racism in the legal system grew louder. The efforts of civil rights organizations and communities forced the government to take notice. They had no choice but to reassess policies and implement reforms, not just to address isolated incidents, but to transform a long-standing system where human rights and equality must be prioritized. The civil rights struggle paved a new path where justice would no longer be skewed and all citizens, regardless of race, would be treated fairly and with respect. Although Martin's case had been resolved, the fight for justice never stopped. He knew that he was just one part of the long battle for the rights and equality of all people. When the investigation concluded and the officers involved were convicted, he didn't feel that justice had been fully served. He understood that while his case might have been resolved, the deeper, more complex issues in society remained unchanged. This fight wasn't limited to one isolated incident, but was an ongoing struggle to create a fair society where racism and abuse of power had no place. The fight for justice is a continuous process, one that never ends, and Martin was fully aware that he needed to keep supporting those efforts. He couldn't stand still when the larger issues in society remained unresolved. Martin continued his work, but this time he wasn't working quietly as before. He used his influence and voice to support comprehensive societal reforms. He didn't engage in public debates, but quietly contributed to change through specific actions. He collaborated with human rights organizations, social activists, and others with the same goals to push for reform measures. Martin recognized that change in the police force was only part of the larger picture, and for true justice to be achieved, society needed to change from the roots. He participated in educational projects, discussions on racism and human rights, and continually fought for a society where every citizen had the right to be treated equally and justly. Martin's struggle didn't stop at changing the police force, but extended to society as a whole, where every individual, regardless of skin color, could live in respect and justice. Reform policies in the police force are no longer just words, but have begun to be implemented nationwide. After significant pressure from the community and human rights organizations, the government decided to take action, and the police system began to face widespread change. One of the first important measures was the establishment of a new reporting and monitoring system to ensure that police actions are continuously tracked and assessed publicly and transparently. Independent organizations were tasked with overseeing police activities, handling complaints from the community fairly. This system not only increases transparency, but also helps protect the rights of citizens, particularly vulnerable communities such as Black communities, against police abuse of power. Investigations will no longer be manipulated by the police, but will be conducted more objectively and fairly. To support these reforms, adjustments in the police force were also introduced. Police officer training was comprehensively changed and upgraded. No longer focused solely on law enforcement skills, training now also emphasizes communication skills, cultural diversity, awareness, and particularly awareness of racism. Police officers are required to participate in regular training on social issues such as racism, human rights, and community-related matters. The goal is to help them better understand how to interact with the community, manage tension without resorting to violence, and most importantly, respect the rights of citizens. The new training programs not only improve police skills, but also help them build better relationships with the community, which can help reduce unfortunate incidents like Marcus's case. Another key element in this reform is fair recruitment. Recruitment criteria have now been changed to ensure that all applicants have equal opportunities. The recruitment process has been improved to seek individuals with strong ethical values who are aware of human rights and equality. Specifically, the process ensures that those with a history of racist behavior or abuse of power will not be hired into the police force. These reforms not only create a police force with high professional qualifications, but also one with solid character and ethics, helping to build a truly fair and humane force that protects justice. In addition to improving training and recruitment, an equally important factor is increasing accountability in police action. Every action of a police officer must be monitored and reported transparently. Police officers are now held accountable for their actions to both the community and their superiors. The independent monitoring system will receive and investigate all complaints, and officers who engage in misconduct will face severe consequences. This is an important step to protect citizens' rights and ensure that no police officer can abuse their power without being detected and held accountable. Accountability in the police force not only helps maintain discipline, but also strengthens public trust in law enforcement. Changes in the police force, though still in the early stages, have already begun to have a positive impact. While the reform process is long-term, these initial steps have shown the public that change is possible and necessary. Civil rights organizations which have fought for the rights of minority communities have recognized that these reforms could be a crucial turning point in building a more just and equal society. Although not all issues can be resolved immediately, these reforms have opened the door to hope for a better future for society as a whole. The police are no longer a tool for discrimination and abuse, but have become a force for justice for all citizens. The government could not stand by while important reforms were being made in the police force. After the reforms were introduced, they began monitoring and investigating police agencies at the national level to ensure that these changes were being implemented correctly. While these reforms have been widely recognized, the government understands that to create lasting change, they must monitor police agencies closely. Authorities must not only pass new regulations, but also conduct regular checks to ensure that these reforms are not eroded over time. The government has established independent monitoring systems and imposed requirements on police departments to regularly report on the implementation of these reforms. This helps ensure that police agencies are genuinely fair in their recruitment, training, training and conduct. They want to ensure that all police actions are transparent and fair, thereby protecting citizens' rights and creating a safer society. Meanwhile, Martin continues to play a crucial role in the fight for justice and social reform, even though he does not directly participate in political discussions or public debates. Martin continues to engage in conversations about justice, but in his own way. He does not speak out loudly, participate in protests, or make statements on media platforms, but he always quietly supports civil rights organizations and social groups in the reform efforts. Martin understands that this reform cannot just be the result of one incident. It must be the result of a change in the mindset and actions of society as a whole. To achieve a fair and equal society, we cannot rely solely on the government or external agencies. We must all take part in this change process. Martin continues to work with human rights organizations supporting initiatives and helping those who face racial discrimination to speak out. He knows that only when everyone from the government to the community works together will real change become a reality. Although he was not the leader of the reforms, Martin contributed greatly to social change. His involvement was not marked by grand speeches, but by steadfast action and quiet support for groups fighting for the rights of oppressed communities. The change in the police force was just one part of a larger social reform that Martin helped drive. He didn't need to speak loudly or become the hero of this story, because his actions created a powerful wave of change within the community. Martin's silence, along with his tireless efforts to support civil rights organizations, helped bring the issues of racial discrimination and justice to the forefront of social discussions. As people began to understand these issues more clearly, change gradually took shape. Martin continues to be part of this greater struggle no matter how he does it. After the successful implementation of reform measures at the local level, the government decided to expand them nationwide. The changes within the police force were no longer limited to one city or region, but became part of the national strategy. Recruitment, training, and oversight processes in law enforcement were standardized across the country to ensure that justice would be executed fairly and transparently nationwide. Police departments in large cities and suburban areas alike had to comply with new regulations regarding human rights and respect for equality. The government also required police agencies to provide regular reports on the implementation of reform measures, from changes in recruitment methods to rebuilding relationships between law enforcement and the community. This was a significant step to ensure that reform was not just a temporary movement, but a comprehensive and sustainable change in how the police operate. This change was not just about regulations or laws, but also about changing the community's mindset. The community began to reevaluate how they treated people of different races. The perception of the rights and dignity of every individual, regardless of race, color, or background, has shifted dramatically. Public dialogues about racial discrimination were no longer just discussions within small groups, but had expanded to encompass the entire society. People began to recognize that racial discrimination exists not only within the police force, but also in many other areas of social life, from education to employment, and even in everyday opportunities. Social organizations, community leaders, and those directly affected began to speak out strongly, demanding that society treat everyone fairly and equally. Significant steps have been taken to reduce racial discrimination not only within the police force, but also in social relationships. Schools began teaching students about issues related to racial discrimination, diversity, and human rights starting in elementary school. Community organizations held educational programs and workshops to raise awareness about equality. No longer just theoretical debates, these actions have become practical steps in daily life to build a more just society. Businesses and organizations also joined this change process, implementing non-discriminatory hiring and promotion policies, thereby creating a fairer working environment for everyone. The community no longer remains silent in the face of discrimination, but instead they have proactively participated in building a more equal and just society. The protests continue, but the goal has become clearer, not only to oppose racial discrimination within the police force, but also to fight for justice in all areas of social life. People are beginning to realize that every small step, every change in the way individuals think and act contributes to a larger societal shift. The community's actions are not just about demanding reforms, but also about changing the way they think and treat each other, thus building a society free from discrimination and injustice. Organizations and individuals continue to fight for equality in every aspect of society, and the momentum from these struggles continues to inspire future generations. The protests, media campaigns, and public dialogues not only oppose racial discrimination, but also call for change in societal mechanisms from education and employment to the legal system. The community is beginning to realize that changing the police force is necessary, but it cannot stop there. Racial discrimination and injustice have existed for so long in many areas, and only when society changes completely will the change in the police force truly matter. Civil rights organizations, human rights groups, and individuals from all walks of life have united to fight not just for justice within the police force, but for a society free of discrimination and injustice. The involvement of the community and organizations in this reform is not just a reaction, but a continuation of a long-term struggle to change societal perception. These organizations, with their experience and persistence in the fight for justice, have continuously pushed for deeper, broader reform policies and measures. Workshops, awareness campaigns, and human rights dialogues have become powerful tools to spread the message of equality. The community has become increasingly aware of the importance of change in every aspect of life, from addressing discrimination in hiring and education to creating fair policies across all societal sectors. These struggles, despite their challenges, have generated a strong momentum for social change. While this change is happening forcefully within the community, Martin does not step back from the fight. He continues to play an important role in maintaining the change and pushing for social reforms. Although not directly participating in protests or political meetings, Martin continues to support organizations and civil rights groups in implementing reform initiatives. He knows his work is never truly finished, and that change will not happen overnight. Martin continues to support social reform efforts from behind the scene, helping to raise community awareness about issues of racial discrimination and justice. He serves as an inspiration for those fighting, motivating them to keep fighting for equality and justice, even knowing that this struggle could last a lifetime. Martin's actions, though small, have contributed to strengthening the broader social reform movement, affirming that everyone can make a difference in the fight for justice. Human rights organizations, civil rights groups, and individuals fighting for justice continue to call on the government to strengthen the implementation of justice and enhance oversight in the legal system. These calls are not limited to discussions, but are also expressed through concrete actions. The community has started to realize that the current justice system has too many flaws and is no longer strong enough to protect the rights of all citizens fairly. Every resistance from these organizations is aimed at one goal, demanding that the government reform oversight mechanisms and ensure that all wrongdoings in the justice system, especially within the police force, are addressed firmly. This is not only a demand from the community, but also a wake-up call for those in power, requiring them to be held accountable for their mistakes. Under intense public pressure, the government understands that it can no longer avoid comprehensive reforms in the legal system. Otherwise, incidents like Marcus's wrongful arrest will continue to recur. In this process, the problems of the old justice system are no longer seen as isolated issues, but must be confronted and addressed openly. Mistakes in the judicial system, abuses of power, and racial discrimination in law enforcement can no longer be be overlooked. Social organizations, communities, and oppressed individuals have made it clear that only when these issues are addressed openly and honestly can they be resolved. The community's constant and powerful voice has made these issues impossible to conceal anymore. The justice system, which may have previously ignored these flaws, now faces a clear demand for change. Investigations into police misconduct and wrongful decisions in cases have become the focal point of political and social discussions. This is the time for every issue within the legal system to be seriously reconsidered. The great lesson from this struggle is courage. Courage comes not only from those directly affected, but from anyone willing to stand up for change. Martin, although not directly participating in protests or public dialogues, has become a symbol of courage through his steadfast silence. He faced injustice without fear, and from his actions he inspired change within the community. His silence was not passivity, but determination and trust in a better future. Human rights organizations and the community have also shown courage by relentlessly fighting to ensure that issues within the legal system are addressed. From demanding reforms to publicly exposing the flaws of the system, they dared to stand up and call for a just society where every citizen is protected and treated equally under the law. It was this courage that created a powerful momentum, opening up opportunities for significant changes in the justice system. The great change did not only come from organizations or leaders, but also from ordinary people in the community, individuals who might have once been silent or afraid to speak out. Now, they are taking action, no longer hesitant in the face of injustice. People who were oppressed or who merely witnessed racial discrimination from a distance are now standing up strongly. They are not only participating in protests, but also engaging in campaigns, organizing public dialogues, and pushing for changes in the policies of public authority. Their actions are not just a form of resistance, but a strong call for a fair and equal society where the rights of all citizens, regardless of race or skin color, are respected and protected. Those who once remained silent are now leading this fight, rekindling faith and hope for a better future. Martin, although not participating in protests or making public statements, continues to be a powerful symbol in this struggle. He embodies steadfastness and courage in confronting injustice without the need for noise or prominence. Even without speaking out directly, his silence has inspired thousands of others to continue pushing for social reforms. Martin is not only a fighter for justice, but also a symbol of persistence in action, of belief in the possibility of societal change, no matter how difficult. His actions, though small, have made a profound impact, driving the community to continue fighting for a more just society. The story of Martin Hayes is not just an isolated case, but a significant lesson for the entire community about equality and justice. Martin's actions sparked a powerful struggle not only against racial discrimination in law enforcement, but also against deeply rooted prejudices in society. While individual mistakes may be resolved in a short time, societal issues like racism require long-term efforts and fundamental change. Martin was not just a victim, but an active force for change, awakening the community's awareness of fairness and human rights. His story made everyone realize that justice cannot merely be a goal set in legal systems. It must be practiced daily, where every individual is treated fairly regardless of race or ethnicity. To build a truly just foundation, new policies have been implemented to ensure no one is treated unfairly because of their skin color. Reforms in law enforcement and other areas of society have been designed to eliminate barriers of discrimination. Human rights and equality education programs have been integrated into schools, and social organizations have begun campaigns to raise awareness of mutual respect between communities. These changes are not only part of systemic reforms, but also the foundation for a truly just society where all citizens are treated with respect and justice. Martin's steadfastness did not need to be expressed through words or loud actions, but he understood that these changes would not stop. He did not need to participate in public debates or stand out in protests. His silence spoke volumes. It was his patience and determination that created a powerful wave driving profound social changes. Martin did not need to do anything more than remain true to his principles and believe in change, even though it would take time. He understood that the struggle for justice is a long process, and despite the difficulties, change would eventually come if the community remained united and persistent. He demonstrated that change does not necessarily have to come from loud actions. Sometimes steadfastness and calmness are the deciding factors. In the end, true justice is no longer just an abstract concept, but the right of every citizen. Martin has become a living testament to this. Though not a traditional hero, his actions created a major turning point in how justice is perceived in society. He fought not only for himself, but for everyone, especially those who had been oppressed for many years. Martin proved that justice is not something distant, but a fundamental right for all. Even small changes can open the door to a fairer world where every individual has the right to be treated equally and protected in all circumstances. The story of Martin Hayes is a challenging journey and a living testament to resilience and courage in the fight for justice and equality. It all began with a heartbreaking event when Marcus Reed, a black man, was wrongly arrested simply because of his skin color. This incident went beyond an act of racial discrimination within the police force. It became a powerful signal that prompted the community and human rights organizations to rise up and fight. Not only was Marcus a victim, but he also became the driving force in bringing this issue to light, sparking a wave of public outrage and forcing the government to listen. Though not the hero of the story, Martin became a role model for change. His silence was not passivity, but a steadfast commitment to doing what was right. He quietly supported civil rights organizations and the community, avoiding loud debates, yet his actions propelled the societal reform process. Although he didn't participate directly in protests or public dialogues, Martin made a significant impact on the community by maintaining his resolve and belief in change, no matter how difficult. He demonstrated that sometimes the greatest changes come from quiet, steadfast action. As the struggle began to yield tangible results, society faced not only changes in law enforcement, but also a new understanding of fairness. Reforms were not limited to the police, but expanded into all sectors of society. The public, from human rights organizations to affected individuals, continued to demand sweeping and robust reforms extending beyond law enforcement to include oversight mechanisms, new recruitment processes, and training reforms. Public discussions helped people realize their rights and pushed for the creation of a society free from racial discrimination. This story offers an important lesson about patience and perseverance in the fight for justice. Martin wasn't the first to stand up, but his actions contributed to a wave of change in the community. Justice is not something distant. It is a right of every citizen, and change can come from small but powerful actions. Reforms, though lengthy and challenging, will ultimately bring a fairer society where everyone has the right to be protected and treated equally.